All right, welcome to F102. We're going to talk about the Joint and Army Capabilities Development Process, normally called JCIDS. I'm Mr. Jim Kennedy.
Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes.
And we're the Team 29 Delro instructors at Fort Belvoir,
Whoop,
whoop, Command General Staff Team. So let's get into this. So these are our ELOs today. We're going to talk about how vision, concept, and doctrine work. We'll talk a little bit about the capabilities-based assessment and how we come up with the domains for solutions called .mil PFP. We'll explain that. We'll go through some of the key players, the change agents, and then we'll explain how we develop our organizations at the end of it, with finishing up with certain documents, requirements and authorization documents. So this is the one we saw last class. Last class in F101, we talked about the strategic and operational requirements, those big documents, how we, through a Title 10 lens, look at the big strategic documents come out from the President and the Joint Staff, and then we produce the Army plan. We've got the Army operating concept that we're shooting to get way out here to the future force. Today we're going to be talking about how we develop capabilities, those new Army warfighting challenges or whatever gaps we have. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, and how do we turn them into TOEs. That's what we're doing today. So this goes out. We have a vision. We talked about this in F101, the Army's vision. We're going to look 15 to 20 years out. We have our current one out there, and it's, again, that's just bones. Then we come up with concepts, the Army's capstone concept, the Army's operating concept, which we introduced last time. And we said those are the basis for future doctrine. So those concepts that we come up with, they aren't doctrine here until we test them, they're approved, and they're accepted. So the new Army, the ADRP 3.0 just came out, and November of 16?
Yep.
And it actually incorporated 2 or 3 items from the warfighting challenges that, according to General Lundy, the CAT commander, that were easy fixes. So those are now in the new ADRP 3.0. So that's how fast we can move on some things. Others will require a little bit more time. So here we go with the Army's concept framework. Again, this is not doctrine, but this leads us to our future doctrine. We mentioned these last time. They're big thinking, far-reaching. The Army's operating concept, which you should have read a little bit for this class. Well, this is for the Army. This is what TRADOC puts out. Then the schoolhouses, the centers of excellence, there are functional concepts for each of those. There's the intel, the fires, the movement, maneuver, sustainment, and others that are out there. The human dimension, that they go out and look at, okay, well, all these different things we want to do in the operating concept, what does that mean to intel, to fires, to movement, maneuver, to sustainment? And how do we get there, and what do we need to do, the solutions? And they break, the schoolhouses break these down into new solutions. So we have our functional concept for sustainment for the future. These are all currently under rewrite based on the new operating concept and should be out in 2017.
And currently, the chairman's capstone concept for joint operations is currently being rewritten. So General Dunford is getting ready to publish his. They're working out at the Joint Staff, and it's important to understand that all the ones that nest into that. So the Army the U.S. Army capstone concept says how the Army is going to fight as part of the joint fight, which is covered in the capstone concept for joint operations. Winning a complex world is a little bit further out, saying how we will continue to develop ourselves to be a part of that fight. And then, as Jim said, the Army functional concepts also in rewritten say how we are going to execute what the Army operating concept and the Army capstone concept say we're going to do. And when we find capability gaps, we then use the .mil PFP domains to fill those capability gaps, which is what we're going to talk about next in the JCIDS system.
But the 2 documents you should read are the Army's operating concept, and once the new ones are published, and this is coming 2017, your functional concept for your branch or functional area.
And I believe medical is going to get their own functional concept. Is that right?
I have not heard that, but that would make sense because right now it's kind of buried under sustainment.
Yeah, so that may be coming in the future as well. Okay,
Chris.
So JCIDS, Joint Capabilities Integration Development System. So it is a capabilities-based approach to identify current and future capability gaps.
It's not just an arms room monitoring device.
It is not an arms. Well, it is an arms room monitoring device, but it's not only that. So this is a joint system, but it's also the one the Army uses. All services use JCIDS. So the Army, Navy, and the Air Force use JCIDS. There used to be an old system, as you can see there on the left, which was very bottom up, often stovepiped, so didn't really get the full integration that it needed. Then we have the new Joint Capabilities Integration Development System, the JCIDS, which really does ensure that everybody gets a look, everybody gets a vote, to make sure that we're not developing a system that works for one branch but not all the others. So that's really the beauty of JCIDS. You can see some of the principles there in the far right. But again, the purpose here is to say, okay, this is a valid requirement that we need to overcome a capability gap, and then moving it forward through whatever process it is, whether it's going to be a non-material solution or a material solution entering through the DAS, which we'll talk about here next.
And also helps to eliminate any redundancy so that the Air Force and the Navy aren't producing an aircraft do the exact same thing. So you have a joint strike fighter to combine their efforts. Or the Marines and the Army build a tank, 2 separate tanks, they both use the same. So it's really much more efficient.
Again, a good example of that would be the JLTV, which we're going to talk more about as the classes go through it.
Even more gooder example.
All right, so this is the JCIDS process. So it is warfighter driven. So you have both the joint version and the Army version here. So if you start on the far left with the COCOMs, they identify a capability gap by looking through their war plans, which they're required to do every other year. They will then say, okay, we have a capability gap. Let's send that up to the Joint Staff through an integrated priority list, an IPL. So that IPL will then get sent to the Joint Staff J7 and the Joint 8, where it'll be assigned down to a service. In our example, we're going to say it's going to go down to the Army. So then it would go down to headquarters DAG8 and then be sent down to the AROC. So the AROC, that's the forum that's going to be able to validate those requirements. They say, yep, the Army is going to accept this, and then they're going to send that off to TRADOC. So TRADOC can also get requirements not just through that process or the Joint Staff, but also from the Army staff, through major commands, through the ASCCs. They're all saying we have requirements. They're sent down to TRADOC, and then RKIC's Capability Development Directorate, they look at them and say, hey, you know what? These requirements are valid. No matter where they came from, they approved the requirement, and they say, now let's send it down to the Center of Excellence, one of the 8 Center of Excellence, to go through the CBA, Capabilities-Based Assessment. 3 parts of the CBA, the FAA, FNA, FSA. Woo! So we'll go over more of that in class, but briefly, the FAA is really looking at what the capability is. The FNA, the Functional Needs Assessment, is saying, okay, what kind of risk are we taking by not filling this gap, or what can we do to mitigate that gap? And then the Functional Solution Analysis, the FSA, that's where we're looking at the .mil PF domains and coming up with a solution to fill that capability gap. So that FSA, the culmination of those, the summarization of those goes into a capabilities document, so an ICD, a CDD, a CPD, or DCR, and we'll talk more about those. I know we're throwing a lot of acronyms at you, and we do that just to make your head spin, but we'll talk more about those as we get into other classes. But those capability development documents are then brought back up through the Center of Excellence, back through RKIC, through TRADOC. They all approve them, and they send them to the AROC through validation. Once the AROC says, yes, we validate this ICD, Initial Capabilities Document, or .mil PF change recommendation, we say they are valid, and we're going to put resources behind it. Then it goes to the JROC if it's a joint function. If it's an Army, we're done. We're off to the races. We're trying to fill that capability gap. If it's a joint, it goes back to the Joint Staff. It goes through their FCB, the JCB, and ultimately to their JROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, and says, yes, this is a valid requirement. We approve this document, and then it will enter into whatever lane it needs to go into to get solved. If it's a material solution, it would go into the Defense Acquisition System. If it was a non-material solution, it would go into some other type of stovepipe or venue to get serviced.
The big thing to remember at the major level right now for you is there is a process. It's not just somebody in a dark room smoking cigarettes, doing darts on a board, typing something into Google and say, how do we solve this? There is a formal, dedicated, analytical process that goes through. It can be slow or it can be fast. We'll talk more about that in a few slides. But there is a process. Your best input for ideas as a major or lieutenant colonel is the Centers of Excellence, or through your ASCCs, MACOM, or RSTAF, depending on where you're working, to get it into TRADOC. So you can have a voice.
Yeah, we absolutely have a voice, and that's what this system provides to us. But for those who are able to keep the pencil out of their eye during my explanation of the JCIDS process, we will go over this again in class, much more slower. So don't worry about it. I know it's kind of overwhelming at this point, but this is an important process, because wherever you go in the future, you're going to hear the term JCIDS. If you work in the building, or if you work at an ASCC or at a COCOM, JCIDS is going to be something you need to be familiar with what it is. So we'll make sure that you have that before you leave. All right, so we briefly talked about the capabilities-based assessment. This is what the Capability Development Directorate in ARCIC assigns down to the Center of Excellence to work those approved requirements. So you got the three areas there, the FAA, the functional area analysis, so identification of the required capability. What is it the Army must do? What is it the strategic documents are saying we need to do? What is the capability that is required? Then go into the functional need analysis, so review available capabilities and the identification of that capability gap and risk. Risk is the big one in the FNA. What is the risk that we are accepting by not having this capability or not servicing that capability gap? And then the functional solution analysis, using the .mil PF domain, P domains, to be able to say, here is our recommendation for going forward to fill that capability gap to meet that requirement. And these are performed there by the Center of Excellence, the CDIDS, and the ICDTs. But this is all TRADOC driven and then sent up to the AROC on the headquarters DA staff for approval. And it is the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Vice who chair the AROC. So they are very involved in this process.
And you'll see down here the insignia. Majors, lieutenant colonels, and warrants are working in these directorates right here. And that's where they take the high-speed majors and lieutenant colonels and say, okay, go out and help us develop that future Army because you do have current tactical experience and helps you be a better leader in the future as well.
And this is not logisticians. Logisticians obviously go there and do that from a sustainment point of view. But this is special forces officers. This is medical officers. This is signal school. This is, I mean, every single branch. So if you're sitting in this class, you may end up in these jobs someday. All right, so here are some of the CBA recommended approaches. So again, using the .mil PFP domains there on the left, you can see some of the outputs. So for doctrine, it may be new or updated doctrine. For organization, it may result in a unit reference sheet, which basically says, hey, we need a new unit to be able to meet this capability gap. So the URS is the first step in reaching that eventual MTO. So it goes to the URS and then to a force development update, to a TOW, and then to an MTO. We'll talk more about that in 103 Alpha. So training, it could be initial training. It could be an individual training plan. It should for leadership and education, so professional military education for leaders.
CGSC is one of those.
Absolutely. Personnel, maybe new manpower or new skill, new MOS or new ASI being assigned. Facilities, be buildings or acquiring new land or weapons ranges, things of that nature. Policy, could be a change in the policy. Or it could be materials, so actually building a new piece of equipment, upgrading a current piece of equipment, something of that nature. But here in the force management blocks, we're really going to focus on organization and material and a little bit of personnel, because we've got to talk about the integration of personnel as well. But that's really what we're going to focus on. But there are 3 different lanes that the JCIDS process can travel in. So yes, this takes a long time, but there are reasons this takes a long time. And believe us, you want it to take a long time, because if you want it fast, you're going to get it fast. But that also means that you're going to either have waste of money, or you're going to develop the wrong thing, or it's going to have a capability that's not actually going to work. All right, so the 3 lanes, you have urgent, emergent, and deliberate. So for urgent, so that's when we're saying that it needs to happen right now. There is a capability gap that's affecting missions, and you can do that through a JUONS or an ONS. JUONS being, of course, the Joint Operational Needs Statement, and an ONS Operational Needs Statement for the Army. So the J8 approves the JUONS, and the AR2B for the Army approves the ONS. And that's a way to get something very quickly. So you can go and buy something off the shelf and get it out there to the soldiers very quickly. Then you have the emergent requirement. This is something that we know is going to come down the road, but it's not currently in our face. So we might need something to for expected attacks through Poland from Russia, or the North Korea coming into South Korea, things of that nature. So things that aren't currently taking place, but we know that have a high possibility of taking place. And again, the JROC or the AROC, JROC for joint capabilities, AROC for the Army capabilities. They will validate that requirement. And then for deliberate requirements. So this is stuff that we know is going to happen down the road. So like the JLTV replacing 1/3 of the Humvee fleet. That would be something that was a deliberate requirement. We knew it was going to come down, so we had the time to develop it and to make sure that all the I's are crossed and all the T's are dotted. So,
or the AMP-V replacing the 113s. Okay. The problem that a lot of the students today, anybody been in the 15 years or under, you're all living that Glenn Fry Eagles life in the fast lane. You think everything you need gets done today because that's the life you've lived in Iraq and Afghanistan. You need it, you got it. Well, there are 2 other lanes that are out there, and the preferred process is the deliberate process. So you have to get out of that understanding of your experience of being everything that you needed was solved quickly. Some stuff, yes, but we're going back to more deliberate processes now that we're not needing as much in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, so how do we build an organization? This is a complicated looking chart, so we're going to walk through it very simply. It's 5 phases. The first 2 phases are what's the mission? What does this new organization, being a unit, have to do? Or it doesn't have to be new. It can be just revised. We can be adding people, changing grades. We can be taking MOSs out. The third phase is what must I have? That's where the DA staff looks at it and runs it through all their processes. And then the final 4 are resourcing. What can you have based on priorities and resources, basically being money. So let's look at, you'll see the crest up here. The first 2 phases are owned by TRADOC. The last 3 are owned by the Army staff. This is what the phases do. So the first phase generates capabilities from .mil PFP solutions. The second phase applies doctrine to make sure that all of our rules are applied and meets everything we want it to do in the future. The G3 then applies all the rules and standards, of workload. You must have X amount of mechanics per vehicle. You must have X amount of cooks per people. You must have X amount of medics, or you must have X amount of radio operators or whatever. And then it gets into what we can afford. Affordability, suitability, and executability. And that's the processes of total Army analysis and programming where we look at money. And then once all that's done, we've made our priorities and decisions, then we create the final document. So, starting at the phase 1, somebody out there has a problem. We talked about that at the start of the JCIDS. Here's a gap we have to solve. The schools look at it, look at our current gaps, and they output the .mil PFP solutions after the CBA. This is all the CBA phase right here. And they'll kick out a couple of documents. You'll see the boxes at the bottom explain what the key documents are that are produced by each phase. So that unit reference sheet, or ICD, will go up to TRADOC, who will then look at it, staff it with everybody else. Because if you're staffing a unit, you'll want to make sure the signal folks look at it, the medical folks, the intel folks. Every branch gets a vote in how this thing is going to operate for whatever, to make sure all their rules are followed. And out pops an approved design that is doctrinally correct, and that's called a force design update. That is then sent to DAG3, who then looks at it, applies all those rules I mentioned before, what you can substitute, what makes sense, what's policy. And then they build the TOE. If it's approved, they build a table of organization and equipment. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. That is a requirements document, what the unit must have for equipment and people by grade and skill, and how many of each. That organization is then put through the total Army analysis process. Okay, we may say we need 6, but how many can we afford to have based on requirements? Because every school has got changes to every organization every year. What did General Papa say? There were like 3,000 changes in 2016.
Alone, yeah.
Alone, just to MTOs and TDAs. 3,000 changes. Now that doesn't, one change may be 100 people, one change may be one person or one piece of equipment. But that's a lot of change. So what can we afford to have based on priorities and dollars that we're going to ask for? So once all that's put out, we complete the R-Struct. We'll mention that we'll go over that in more depth in the TA process.
R-Struct is Army structure.
Yeah. We'll go over that in TA and F103 Alpha. But that tells the Army what they're going to look like starting in 2 years for the next 5 years after that.
It also tells us what the best mix is, so not everything has to be in the active force. Some
Right.
can be in the reserves, the National Guard.
Yeah, great point. They break it out, what's going to be active guard and reserve, based on priorities, timelines, etc. So once that's done, once we finally get an approved program of how much money we're going to ask for, we go into the documenting phase. Okay, so here we may have wanted 10,000 JLTVs as an example on TOEs, but because of money and priorities, we can only afford 9,000. Then they will document the shortages on the MTOs, so the MTO will show where those units will not have JLTVs, where that 1,000 shortage will be. And you're able to see that in the force management system, which we'll talk about in 103, F103 Alpha.
Yes.
Okay? So again, we'll go over this much more in class, but again, the point of the slide is there is a methodical, thought out analytical process to develop an organization. You may not understand why your organization has that MTO, but a process was designed and methodically thought out and risk assumed. That's why your organization looks like that. So these are some of the key players. We'll just briefly mention them. We'll go over much more in class. TRADOC is the premier capability developer for the Army. They do all of it. That's the Training and Doctrine Command. They don't do just schoolhouses and basic training. They also do the doctrine and design of that through their analysis center and ARCIC. ARCIC right here. Combined Arms Centers, the Army's think tank out at Fort Leavenworth. You have a Brigade Modernization Command. It's out at Fort Bliss that they try a lot of ideas on. What did we see in that report? Like 6 billion? No, 2 billion. I think it was 2 billion. Don't quote me on that. But because of these network integration exercises,
savings.
Yeah, the savings.
Yeah, $2 billion in savings due to the integration exercises they're conducting at Fort Bliss.
Yeah, by testing things and seeing what works and what doesn't work. They don't go buy something and then try it out and say it doesn't work. So they're testing it out, putting all the onus on contracting, on industry to make sure it works. Your development systems.
Yeah, the Capability Directorate and the Concept Development and Learning Directorate. So those are the ones that are, those two directorates are really focused on finding what are those capability gaps and then recommending solutions. So those are the two directorates under TRADOC and under ARCIC that are really focused on that.
The Centers of Excellence, that's the schoolhouses. We talked about them a minute ago, where they work. That's where good Army majors go to work to help develop that future Army. And then the DAG8 is all about resourcing. How much can we afford? Where's the money going to be applied to based on priorities from the G3?
Capabilities integration.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so we briefly talked about these through many of the slides that we've talked about, and we'll talk more about these in other classes, but I want to make sure everybody understands what the major force development documents are. So the first one, going back to the force development process, the 5 phases that Jim talked you through, the output of phase 1 for a development document would be the unit reference sheet. And this is just the basic building blocks of what we believe a unit should be. If we say we have a capability gap and we're recommending an organizational change, this is what's going to start that, and it's going to say this is what we think the unit should be able to do to meet those capability gaps. So that's the first phase 1 output is the URS. Then you would also have the force design update and phase 2 of the force development process. So the FDU is now putting a little bit more meat on the bones. It has 6 parts, and it again is starting to say, okay, the URS said it needs to have this. The URS then becomes part of the FDU as one of the parts of it, but it gives more detail about this is what the unit should look like and this is what the unit should do. Then the first doctrinal look at it is in phase 3. So the table of organization equipment, a TOE, the full meal deals. This is a requirements document. It's saying the unit needs this number of people and this type of equipment to be able to accomplish its mission. But as Jim said, we don't always have enough money for that. So then you go to phase 5, the MTO, modified table of organization equipment. This is the authorization. This is what the unit is going to get. So while the TOE says it's required that I have 100 of these, the MTO says we're only going to have 80. So requirements document, TOE, authorization document, MTO. TOE, this is what I need. MTO, this is what you're going to get. And you can see all of that through the FMS web system, which we talk more about in 103 Alpha.
And when we do budgeting, you'll just to link it in, when we ask Congress for money, we base everything off of the TOE, actually the objective TOE, what TOE we're going to need in 2 to 5 years. So we're already asking Congress for what money we're going to need to support the JLTV in 5 years once we start fielding it. So it's always based on the TOE, what we are required to have to meet mission requirements. The MTO is what we can afford to have based on what we're given and other priorities. All right, so other documents we have the TDA for operating force. These are things like MedCom, INSCOM, some of the R staff, the ASCCs, things like that. You have augmentation TDAs for reservists. You have joint documents for what we provide, the services provide to the joint force, because there are no joint officers and no joint equipment. The services provide equipment to the joint force. So, and you can see down here at the bottom how many of each there are. Look at the number of MTOs, 5,320, and the last time they were updated, and TDAs, almost 2,600 of those, and when they were updated. So the MTO and the TDA are the two biggest authorization documents that are used for the Army.
Now, MTO unit can also have a TDA, but strict TDA units usually don't have MTOs.
Yeah.
They won't have an MTO, but an MTO unit could have a TDA to give them additional authorizations.
Like a EO officer, recruiting NCO, and SARC.
Yeah, all those would be on a TDA for an MTO unit, but it's usually the generating force that has TDAs.
Yep. Okay, so this is our summary. We've talked about the roles of vision, concept, and doctrine in the Army's operating concept. We talked about how we develop our solutions through a .mil PFP framework using the capabilities-based assessment. We went through all the change agents, all the key players. We talked about the CBA process. You can now understand at least a little bit. You're familiar with the force development process, how we build an organization or how we change it, and some of the terms and differences between some of the authorizations and requirements documents at the bottom. And I think that'll do it for 102, and we will see you again in 103.
Hang in there.